One day I'm at home and the phone rings, not once, but two or three times, and I'm like, okay, but wait a minute. You called me on my bugged telephone, and you've always told me never call from that phone. And I said, so what changed? Why did you feel comfortable calling me? And one of them said, well, nothing's going to happen to us now. They could feel that.
That's Ann Cooper, editor-in-chief of Harriman Magazine, talking about her time as NPR's Moscow correspondent during the late Soviet era, when the freedom to speak openly had just started emerging all over the country. I'm Masha Udensiva-Brenner. I edit the magazine with Ann, and I'm excited to introduce the first episode of Beyond the Scoop, a podcast that delves deeper into some of the themes we cover in our publication, which is printed annually by Columbia University's Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. In our most recent issue, we looked back in time to reframe how we see some of the events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the post-communist transition in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. While working for NPR, Ann covered events that we're still interpreting and reframing more than 3 decades later. In this interview, you'll hear what that was like, starting with how Ann came to be in Moscow covering the collapse of the Soviet Union. You ended up in a reporter's dream. The final years of the Soviet Union, so many reporters had wanted this sort of access, but you weren't even a specialist in the Soviet Union. Can you talk about how you came to be there?
Well, I had never visited until December of '86. I went there because at the time I was married to another journalist who was being sent as a Moscow correspondent for the New York Times.
In 1986, Ann was already a decade and a half into a vibrant journalism career.
I did lots of different things, all of them for print. I worked for newspapers, I worked for magazines, I covered Congress, lots of very issue-oriented types of coverage. I hadn't spoken a word of Russian. It had never really been on my radar screen until suddenly I was going to be going there in a few months.
That led to an immersive course in Russian, 9 months of language training provided by the New York Times for both its correspondents and their spouses. The training was tailored for journalists.
The tutors were very tuned in to what we needed when we got there, which was be able to speak, be able to ask questions, and be able to read, but mainly to read the newspapers, which were full of Soviet jargon, Communist Party jargon. It was like almost learning another separate language from the Russian itself.
Do you remember the day you arrived and what that was like, landing in the airport, going to your apartment?
It was, of course, incredibly cold and dark. It was the end of December. I don't remember what time it was getting dark, but certainly by mid-afternoon you were losing sunshine. For the first few days we stayed at the Intourist Hotel, and that was a kind of a grim place, and yet that was top of the line.
It was a hotel meant only for foreigners, and as far as Soviet accommodations went, it was considered to be a luxury one. It was also a place full of vigilance.
All the rooms were bugged, and there was a dejurная who could see you come and go, and it was easy to keep tabs on people there.
What kind of an effect did that have on you, on your mental health, your physical health even?
You know, because we arrived when we did, when it was still the old Soviet Union, but Gorbachev was in power, and things literally within weeks started to change, I don't think it had the same kind of psychological impact that it had had on generations of correspondents before us.
Ann's stay in the Soviet Union coincided with the introduction of Mikhail Gorbachev's Glasnost policy. Glasnost means openness, and it was a huge game changer for freedom of speech and the press in the Soviet Union. But when Ann landed in Moscow, Glasnost had barely begun.
When I first arrived, 1986, 1987, many people were still afraid to talk to us. People didn't want to be seen or found to have spoken with a foreigner because it could lead to terrible repercussions. I remember New Year's Eve of 1986, going down to Red Square, and in my not very good Russian at that point, trying to strike up conversations with people and getting these kind of frightened looks, and and they would not quite run away, but people did not want to engage with me.
As a radio reporter, you're a lot more obvious because you have all this audio equipment than as a print journalist. What was it like to be such an obvious reporter there?
Well, radio's not nearly as obvious as TV is, thank goodness. There were people, I think, who were put off or nervous about being recorded, and I hadn't really done any radio until I went to Moscow. So it took a while to learn how to make people relax, to do exactly what you're doing right now, which is keeping eye contact with me so that I'm not even seeing the microphone.
Once Anne learned the techniques, she felt the microphone became almost an ally.
If you're not having to look down at your notebook and write all the time, you can make a stronger connection with people and get them to relax and open up more. And it helped a whole lot that Gorbachev was opening doors toward allowing people to speak a lot more freely. Without that, I would have been much more handicapped as a radio reporter.
Anne can still pinpoint a moment when she felt a palpable change in the way her sources interacted with her.
I remember distinctly a day, maybe it was 1987, there was a Jewish refusnik, Fyodor Finkel, who had been doing a hunger strike. All the correspondents would go and talk to him and do updates on Fyodor demanding to be released, allowed to leave the Soviet Union. And so one day I'm at home and the phone rings, not once, but 2 or 3 times, and it's other Jewish refusniks calling to tell me Fyodor Finkel got his permission.
News about Finkel aside, the fact that sources had called her at home was confusing. She asked one of them to explain.
You called me on my bugged telephone, and you've always told me never call from that phone, so you'd have to go out and find a working phone, which was not easy, and stick your money in, and it's freezing cold, and you're trying to talk to somebody out on the street. And I said, what changed? Why did you feel comfortable calling me? And one of them said, well, nothing's going to happen to us now. They could feel that.
Were more people speaking to you on the streets as well?
Oh, yeah. If NPR said, gee, we want to get some reaction from people in Russia to the Berlin Wall falling or some other incredible event that was happening, I could literally walk to the end of my block and just stop people, and most of them would talk to me.
And in the midst of all this newfound openness, even Soviet journalists writing for Soviet publications started reporting the truth.
They were doing their jobs. They were holding people accountable. They were revealing history that had been hidden, swept under the rug, or just erased or airbrushed out of photos. It was amazing, just amazing to see.
With Gorbachev's Glasnost policy, the freedom to speak openly was rapidly changing Soviet society. And yet, it's important to remember that Glasnost did not mean unfettered freedom of the press. That's a theme another Moscow correspondent of that era, Jeff Trimble, explores in the latest issue of Harriman Magazine. Jeff, whom you'll meet in a later episode of Beyond the Scoop, tells the story of working with a Soviet journalist on an ambitious reporting project. Things ended very badly for his Soviet colleague, exposing the limits of what Gorbachev meant by openness. Did you see any of that while you were there? Did you see Glasnost being put to the test, and what was that experience like?
Definitely. It was a story that we all wrote about over and over again. Yes, there's Glasnost. People are freer than they were, and here are some examples of that. At the same time, such and such a magazine or newspaper published something last week, and the editor was called on the carpet by the Kremlin.
You know, the theme of this issue is reframing, how we look back on that period. Could you give our listeners kind of a sense of what our purpose was using reframing as a theme for the issue?
I think one of the goals was to remind people that it was all a lot more complicated than they probably remember. And I do think that those of us who were reporting, whether it was in the Soviet Union or in East Germany or wherever, I think that we were doing our best to give nuance and when to say, for example, what Mikhail Gorbachev means by Glasnost is not what we mean by freedom of the press. And yet a lot of that nuance kind of gets lost, and especially over time. It was not a straight path by any means.
In Jeff Trimble's Harriman Magazine story, he argues that Western policymakers failed to account for the fact that Glasnost was quite different from press freedom. And because of that, he says they may have pushed Russia too hard and too quickly to adopt Western-style reforms. That created a backlash, and Jeff believes it helped pave the way for Vladimir Putin and his repression of independent media. Independent media has been on shaky ground all over Eurasia and Eastern Europe in the aftermath of communism. I asked Anne about another story in Harriman Magazine that reframes our understanding of what happened in the Baltics by tracking the rise and fall of an independent media outlet.
Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are seen as kind of the three big post-Soviet success stories among the 15 former Soviet republics. One of the pieces written by Inga Springa, who's a Latvian journalist, Inga wrote about what happened there through the prism of the first independent newspaper in Latvia, which she worked for.
The paper is called Diena, and in the early post-Soviet years, it published some of the most rigorous corruption investigations in the country, until it was taken over by the very oligarchs whose corruption it was exposing. Inga's article invites us to reframe the Baltic success story by reminding us of political struggles often overlooked in historical narratives about that region.
You begin to realize, it was a lot more complicated. It was a lot more precarious. And you're thinking, so wait a minute, they have freedom and democracy in Latvia, and they're part of the EU, and they're members of NATO, but it didn't necessarily have to turn out that way. Every one of these stories is different, and every one of them has a lot of nuance in it. And I think that was one of the goals of going back and looking at some of these situations.
As we spoke, I thought of how Anne had covered the independence movements in the Baltics for NPR, and also Moscow's efforts to stifle those movements. And you know what I realized today is that our interview is on the anniversary of the day the tanks rolled into Vilnius on January 13th, 1991.
I was reminded of that this morning when I opened my email, and there was a message from a friend who lives in Kaunas, and she talked about how every year we light candles early in the morning to commemorate this, and she said it always brings tears to my eyes. All these years later, it happened in 1991.
Does it bring tears to your eyes?
When I hear some audio from that time, tanks coming up to the TV tower and this really chilling recording that they were playing, telling people, you must go home. We have taken over. Protect your families. Go home to your families.
In case you don't remember what happened, Lithuania declared its independence from the Soviet Union on March 11th, 1990. The Kremlin rejected the declaration, and when economic and political pressures didn't stop the independence drive, Soviet tanks rolled into Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital.
You are listening to the sound of the Soviet army in Vilnius, Lithuania, early this morning.
Soldiers attacked unarmed protesters who had gathered to protect the city's television and broadcast tower, killing 14 people and reclaiming the vital broadcast facility for the Kremlin. Anne was there, recording the events.
The voice you will hear is NPR's Ann Cooper reporting.
Several of these shots have been fired. People are starting to leave from around the...
It was really scary, very intimidating. The sound was so frightening, and you just thought, here I am in the middle of this combat zone, except it wasn't really combat because the Lithuanians were not armed. They had some hunting rifles inside the TV tower, but the people surrounding it were just there singing Lithuanian songs. It was an incredible scene until the tanks started coming, and it was just horrifying.
And was this your first time covering something like that?
I covered a lot of tragic things, like the aftermath of a horrific earthquake in Armenia in December 1988. All of us who covered those final years of the Soviet Union were covering many dramatic events, a lot of them political, some of them violent, like the attack on the Vilnius TV tower. There was so much happening every single day.
Another memorable event for Anne was the August 1991 attempted coup, when hardliners in the Communist Party tried to oust Gorbachev from power.
Scary at first, and yet you just always had this sense of these hardline communists who want to roll everything back. Boy, are they out of touch with this country. People have had their taste of freedom now. They are not going to accept you rolling everything back to the bad old Soviet days. And it turned out that was the case. So it was over within 3 days.
A couple of days after the attempted coup, Gorbachev returned to Moscow feeling victorious. But his country was fragmenting. He was losing authority. And on Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. Within a few days, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Were you surprised at all when the Soviet Union dissolved?
I don't think any of us were surprised that it dissolved. The timing of it? Yes, maybe. I've often thought about this, like if somebody had asked me a few months earlier in 1991, when do you think it will all be over? I'm not sure what my answer would have been, but it wouldn't have been, by the end of this year. I think it happened faster, somewhat faster than we expected.
Anne moved to another assignment shortly before the Soviet Union collapsed. In a piece for Harriman Magazine a few years ago, she wrote that when she left, euphoria was still high, and the future seemed to hold democratic promise for what would soon be 15 separate countries. Anne says she felt optimistic, because journalists had pushed well beyond Gorbachev's boundaries, creating a new tradition of independent journalism in Russia. So independent that some had the courage to stand up to the communist hardliners in August 1991. It was precisely that courage that helped bring down the coup attempt against Gorbachev.
I saw so much more how important journalism could be in a society where everything had been so constrained. And I think a lot of us thought they've been doing their jobs and they're going to keep on, and that's going to help with the transition to the post-Soviet era.
But in the 1990s, euphoria gave way to economic and political chaos. In Russia, where journalists had been heroes during Glasnost, the newspapers and TV channels they worked for struggled to survive and to pay them. The journalists, in turn, started taking money from businessmen and politicians who commissioned them to write favorable stories.
The biggest thing really was money. How do you finance independent journalism? Well, these journalists started their work when it was still a communist subsidized press, but suddenly, poof, the communists are not in control anymore. All those subsidies are gone. There wasn't advertising. And so to find a financial model turned out to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. And that was definitely something that we didn't foresee, the far-reaching impact that was going to have on the independent media that began in those last years.
When we look at the crackdown on independent media in Vladimir Putin's Russia, we tend to lay all the blame for the demise of press freedom on Putin himself. But we forget that the story is more complicated, that earlier events helped enable Putin's crackdown. It's hard to say whether things would have turned out differently if policymakers in Russia and in the West had paid more attention to fostering independent journalism instead of losing themselves in the sea of euphoria surrounding the collapse of communism. But we can derive lessons from that period, especially now, when the fight for press freedom has become so global, including here in the United States. I'm Masha Udensiva-Brenner. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Scoop, a podcast from Harriman Magazine at Columbia University's Harriman Institute. This podcast was written and produced by me and edited by Ann Cooper. If you like what you heard, please leave a rating and review on your podcast platform. It really helps. Until next time.